In this video, we're going to take a look at DHCP reservations. Sometimes you have clients that you want to keep set to obtain an IP address dynamically from DHCP. However, it would be inconvenient if their address is changed. Right now, we're here on client 1, and it has obtained an IP address from DHCP. It's picked up 192.168.1.51. And that's probably fine for a client computer because if I move this to another network, I want it to change. So I want to leave it set. But a typical example of something where you don't want the IP address to change would be a printer or a copier. Now, if you have something set to DHCP, it always picks up the very next address that's available. So why would the IP address for a printer or copier change? Well, maybe it had been picked up the 51 address, and then it goes down for a while. The printer's broke. So that 51 goes back into the address pool, and then something else gets that address. Then when that printer boots up, you fixed it, it's not going to pick up 51 because that's already been given to somebody else. The problem is with a printer, you set up the clients to point to the printer at a specific address. So if the printer's address changes, typically you would need to reconfigure all the clients. On the other hand, you might not want to set a static IP address because it's not critical infrastructure. So if you have to change the IP addressing scheme of the network, it would be inconvenient to reconfigure the printer. You'd have to find the printer wherever it lives. You'd have to deal with the little LCD monitor. It's a pain in the neck. So that's where reservations are useful. A reservation is a combination of an IP address from the scope and a MAC address. When you create a reservation, the DHCP server will only lease that IP address to the client with that MAC address. So we're going to be creating a reservation for client 1. What we need to take a note of is the MAC address of this client, because remember, the client uses broadcast. That's the only way the DHCP server knows which client you're talking about. So that's this physical address here, the 00155D01471D. That's the MAC address we're going to use when we create our reservation. So now that we know the client's MAC address, let's go over to our DHCP server. So we're here on the DHCP server, and here's the scope that the client has obtained an IP address from. And if we go into leases, you can see there's that 51 address to client 1. And you can see over here, it's got the unique ID of client 1. Now, I could just right-click here and make this into a reservation, but I want to do it manually because I want the client to pick up a different IP address so it's easier to understand what's going on for the video. So we're going to go into reservations and say, all right, we're going to do a new reservation. And this reservation is going to be for client 1. But actually, the DHCP server doesn't care what you name it. You could name it dog poop and it would be fine. We're going to tell it to reserve IP address .70. And now we have to provide the MAC address of client 1. Well, that was 00155D01471D. I have that written down. I didn't memorize it. Let's go ahead and add that. And there's our reservation. So now the DHCP server is only going to give that .70 address to client 1 or whatever checks in with that MAC address. Note that a reservation has to be a valid address from the pool. So if you have exclusions, like we've excluded 1 through 50 and 101 through 199, your reservation cannot come from the excluded addresses because excluded addresses are never given out. So a reservation is a good address from the pool that can be given out, but now it's been reserved for that client. It will only be given to that client. So let's go back to the client and renew and see what happens. So back on our client, we want to do our ipconfig/renew. And it says, hey, you're not too happy with that. And it might be because I'm trying to renew, but the DHCP server is saying you can't renew .51. You're supposed to get .70. So I think the easiest thing to do is an ipconfig/release. We'll let go of the 51. Now let's try our renew. It's much happier. And there's the .70. I could have re-recorded the video and taken out that error with the renew, But sometimes you see errors like that, and it's a weird one. I wouldn't automatically know what that is. If you're trying to renew, you get a weird error, try a release and then a renew. So you can see the client picked up the .70, which was the IP address that was reserved for that client. So that's it for this video. In this video, we talked about DHCP reservations. DHCP reservation is an address from the pool and a MAC address of a client where the DHCP server will only give that address from the pool to that client. And therefore, devices where you don't want to set a static IP address because they're not critical infrastructure, but you would prefer that the IP address not change.